For those who didn't attend last week's discussion on the importance of fostering a sense of control, and forgive me if my eyes go to my script, I haven't had time to learn this off by heart. So the Quality of Life Foundation and what their ambitions are set up really to raise people's quality of life by making well-being central to the way we create and care for our homes and communities, which seems a pretty pertinent ambition, particularly at the moment, given how much time people are spending in their homes and communities, probably in a way that people haven't for years. And the Quality of Life Foundation are working with partners in the industry to look at how we can build more homes and communities that prioritise people's physical, social and psychological well-being over the long term. And right now, the overwhelming message is that the design of new housing environments in England are mediocre or poor. And with pressure put upon people by the coronavirus pandemic, with implications on housing production, land value, job and rental security, and a seismic shift towards hybrid working, which is a very pertinent point, it's more important than ever that we focus on what people need for their homes and communities and how we can improve their well-being for the long term. And I would imagine probably everyone on this webinar has, in the last few weeks, had conversations with either co-workers or clients or whoever it might be, where this whole subject of how we are going to live and work in the near future plays out and changes, because undoubtedly it will. As a national community, we've had an opportunity to improve our homes and communities for ourselves. We have an opportunity to improve our homes and communities for ourselves and for next generations. We have a chance to make them more sustainable, more exciting. Oh yes, please, more exciting, greener, cleaner and safer. And the Quality of Life Foundation and their partners are starting to build a movement that will change the way places are designed and built for years to come, using a number of themes. Today, the theme we're looking at is the importance of having access to nature. So there you are. The Quality of Life Foundation has, as you can tell, pretty modest ambitions, but you know, all of this is so good and timely, because it seems to me anyway that there's a great opportunity at the moment that is coming out of what is otherwise a pretty challenging experience for all of us. Now, I just want to add at this point, the Quality of Life Foundation have asked me to add this note regarding Tony Pidgley, who some of you may know, the founder and CEO of the Berkeley Group. He was instrumental in the creation of the Quality of Life Foundation, and his commitment to and belief in people and communities will be the lasting legacy of a remarkable life. We're grateful for Tony's foresight and leadership, and with Berkeley Group's support, without which this endeavour, the Quality of Life Foundation, would never have happened. And our sincere condolences go to his family and all of Berkeley Group. So yes, I'm passing that message on, but those of you on the webinar who knew Tony or know of his work and the work not just within his professional life, but outside of that, I'm sure would also echo those sentiments. And we have Louise Clarke with us, who worked with Tony, who we'll be introducing in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to now introduce you to the panelists. It's very important that I get everything right on this. And we're all calling in from various parts of the country. Probably when it comes to you, actually, maybe you'd like to say where you're calling in from. Actually, I'll start. I'm in a hotel room in Harrogate. Very exciting. I don't have a wall reading light like that at home. Just in case you're wondering who has a wall reading light like that in their home. No one. So start with Louise Wyman. Louise took up the role of Strategic Director of Growth and Development at Manchester City Council in May this year. What a time to start a new job, driving forward growth and economic recovery following the COVID-19 outbreak. And previously she was central to Edward Lister's team that established the government's housing agency. Is that correct, Louise? Or do you want to unmute yourself for a moment and challenge any of that?
I won't challenge it, absolutely right. I wish I was beaming into you from Manchester, but actually when I started this role, we went into lockdown. We'd actually already gone into lockdown when I started the role. So I am talking to you from Northamptonshire. I'm sitting in my hall, and my partner is probably about to go off to work. So if there's some clattering in the background when we're talking, that's what's happening. But I've been working for Manchester City Council for coming up for a month, but we're all remote at the moment. So it's sort of a symptom of the time we're in.
Very good. Northamptonshire, just down the road from where I normally am. Right, we'll go to Louise Clarke. Louise is the head of Sustainable Places at Berkeley Group. The group won the Most Sustainable House Builder of the Year award last year. We've been recognised for our commitment to being a carbon positive business and their approach to net biodiversity gain. Putting sustainability first was a very important part of Tony Pidgley's ethos and legacy, and something the group will maintain at the forefront of the business. Welcome, Louise.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, so that's our legacy, and I'm calling in from London, so just at my home in London at the moment.
Okay, and we're going to refer to you as Louise C and Louise W, otherwise it's going to get horribly confusing. And finally, Loyd Grossman. Loyd has a long association with the arts and heritage sectors, has served on the boards of a number of cultural institutions, including English Heritage, being awarded a CBE in 2015, and is now the chairman of the Royal Parks, a new charity that manages and fundraises for London's Royal Parks. Loyd, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm in South Warwickshire, which may excuse perhaps my sort of faltering digital connection, but it also exposes the need that we have in this country to really make sure that we have great rural broadband if we want to do the levelling up which ministers are so keen on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm afraid I was bragging about the fabulous rural broadband in Rutland, where I'm usually based, although, as I mentioned earlier, I'm currently in Harrogate. My name's Matthew Wilson. I'm a landscape designer. I work primarily in the domestic side of things, but I'm in Harrogate because I'm actually working on a big project with Yorkshire Tea, which is very interesting, and have worked in the heritage sectors with English Heritage at Rest Park and National Trust at Seaton Delaval and Mottisfont Abbey. And I'm also a panellist on Gardener's Question Time on Radio 4, so you possibly may recognise my voice if you have ever listened to that bit of sort of cultural icon of the airwaves, which is Gardener's Question Time. Great. Okay, so we're going to move on to a quick introduction to the theme of access to nature, and then get into some of the questions. So, access to nature is vital to our well-being. The natural environment's incredibly important to our physical and mental health, and during lockdown, every interaction with nature has become a precious thing, and I would imagine all of us have got anecdotes relating to interaction with nature during lockdown. The decision to close parks in cities at an early stage presented a nightmare for those cooped up in small flats. But the restrictions on car use in suburban and rural locations has shown us that it's not just city dwellers that have difficulties getting closer to nature. We've been able to take a step back, slow down, and realise quite how important having a local park, garden, or a balcony is. And this is something we must take forward into the future of building and placemaking. And I'm going to just briefly add to that my own take on various conversations that I've had with people over the lockdown period, which it seems to be, and I'd be interested to know what the rest of the panel think, but it seems to me that one of the biggest divides in terms of the experience that people have had during lockdown is that if you are in a rural location with a nice house and a nice garden and good internet and everything else, lockdown has not been particularly difficult. It may have been worrying in terms of financial aspects or work aspects, but it hasn't been particularly challenging. And yet family and friends of mine who are still in London, where I moved out a few years ago, have had a very, very different experience. particularly those who live in flats, for example. So there we are. And I think that's going to be a sort of ongoing issue potentially, or an ongoing imbalance. Right, okay, so we're going to move on to the questions. Enough of me waffling on. And we're going to start with a question for Louise Clarke, please. The question is, what are the physical and mental benefits of bringing nature into the built environment across the urban to the rural scale, and what role has nature played over the past 3 to 4 months in caring for communities?
So I think the last 3 to 4 months have demonstrated to us more than ever that the importance of nature has already been said. And I think it's given us that opportunity to reconnect with nature and understand its importance in our lives, because often we're all so busy getting on with our day-to-day lives that we do forget to get out in nature and interact with it on a daily basis. But I think the recent situation has helped us to step back and realise how important it is. And often for many people it has been their lifeline during lockdown, just to get out, have a different change of scenery, and to connect with it. A lot of people have anecdotally said about how they've also been able to experience the change in seasons as well. So when we first went into lockdown, it was more towards, the early spring, and people have been able to see spring develop into summer over the last few months, which has had a great benefit as well. So I think that, the general benefits for people are both physical and mental. So it gives us the opportunity to exercise. It gives us the opportunity to get a different perspective, but also the mental benefits are proven. And recently, the Wildlife Trust have been running a wild rewilding, and one of their campaigns has been about 30 days of acts of kindness within nature. And the research from that has really demonstrated that the people that have been involved in that, they feel their well-being has improved, their overall health has improved. So it's also helped their physical and mental well-being, including if they have any respiratory effects or other health implications, just by being outside in nature and doing good things for nature, whether it's planting a tree or whether it's watering an area that's needed, is really had a great improvement. And also I think for young children, there's a lot of research out there that has demonstrated that children that have access and regular interaction with nature, they are able to take a few more risks, they generally have better self-esteem, and they are more confident in their interactions in a social sense as well. So nature has many benefits for us, and I think there's different scales of nature that we need to consider, from the urban to the rural. So within urban areas, we often feel like there's a lack of access to nature, but really London and a lot of England does have access to great parks. So we need to ensure that as we build our future, that parks and nature are an integrated part of the urban design, and we think about the different types of access to nature that we can provide within our built environment. We all love our open parks where we can play, but we also need to think about those more quieter areas so that we can get close to nature and sometimes have some peaceful, quietful time, because that's just important for our mental health and physical well-being.
Does anyone else on the panel want to come in on that response from Louise? I mean, I've got a question that I'd like to ask, but I'm just wondering whether anyone wants to add anything to that. No? Okay. I mean, one question that I would like to ask, I don't know, I mean, maybe that's not something that any studies have been done on yet, but there clearly has been an imbalance in terms of access to nature throughout lockdown, depending on where you live and your relative wealth, and as simple as if you're in a multi-story flat or if you're in a comfortable home. So how is there, clearly there is an imbalance, but how can we seek to address that imbalance?
Yeah, it's a difficult it's a difficult balance, because a lot of people who have had gardens have really appreciated those gardens in recent months, but and the policy has been around densification of our urban areas, but if you have good urban design, you can improve the amount of open space that is available. So in one of our developments, Kidbrooke, when that used to be a housing estate, we have actually doubled the density within that footprint and doubled the density of open space. So it's just about ensuring that you plan correctly, and then you intertwine the green space throughout the development, so that then there is access and there's enough space for people to walk and use that throughout their daily lives, as well as giving them enough space for the weekends where they maybe want to be in that space a bit longer. So I'm not sure if there's any research that's been done over the last 3 months, but I'm sure that there will be a lot of research that's done in this area in the next kind of year or so to provide further evidence for that.
That's great, thanks, Louise. Well, moving on from that and picking up on that point of planning of urban spaces and improvement of urban spaces, Loyd, it feels as if parks have turned into a bit of a battleground over the summer, and the closure of some parks during lockdown has certainly had an impact. There's been quarantine raves in Manchester and other places. Park workers faced with clearing tons of litter, all manner of sort of naming and shaming going on in social media as people have used parks. Fines have been issued for antisocial behaviour. It's become a real hotspot. How do we encourage the use of green spaces and the growth of green spaces in such a way they're not abused and degraded through overuse?
Well, I think, firstly, it's important to remember that the pandemic has created a lot of new issues, but most significantly, it's just accelerated a lot of issues that were quite important anyway. For a very long time, I've been worried about the privatization of space, the monetarization of space, the chipping away of the public realm. And I think the pandemic has pointed out how important the public realm is and what we need to do to defend it. The royal parks are in an extraordinary position because, of course, we have 5,000 acres of the most important land, not only in London, but in all of the country, and a huge public who want to benefit from that, as they rightly should. Pressure of numbers has always been an issue for us because parks must be open access. There's no way to ration access to parks without destroying the whole idea of a public park. So even before the pandemic, we have at least 77 million visitors a year, which, for example, is twice as many visitors as Disneyland and Disney World put together. It's more than all the visitors to all the national museums. So the weight of numbers is really quite considerable. And certainly that has gone up by 15, possibly even 20% since the pandemic started. The closure by local authorities of some of their parks was something that really concerned me, because not only was it going to deprive people of access to their local open spaces, it was going to pile huge pressure on the public realm spaces that remained open. And we in the Royal Parks were absolutely determined that we were going to be open. So the big issue is pressure of numbers, and then the behavioral issues. We've seen a 50% increase in litter. Now, a lot of that is probably due to people who have not previously been regular users of the parks, and therefore don't quite understand the obligations that come with access to the public realm. Because the Royal Parks, with the exception of one park, all the Royal Parks are grade 1 listed landscapes. We don't want to fill the parks with signage telling people what they can or can't do, nor do we want to have endless patrols of uniformed people telling the public what they can and can't do, because one of the essences of a park is being able to relax and enjoy. So we've embarked, on a pretty major behavioral challenge, largely through the use of social media, just encouraging people to treat the parks as they would their own space, because after all, they do own the parks, treat the parks as they were their own spaces, and behave in a more considerate, in a more sort of communal, collegiate way. So for example, this summer, we're launching our thing this summer, not quite as alluring as the Summer of Love. We are launching the Summer of Kindness. We're trying to explain to more people what their obligations are in return for the privilege of using and enjoying the parks. It's a difficult process. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be solved this year. But I believe that public education will create a positive public response, and we'll be able to keep our parks as the tranquil, welcoming spaces that we all want to enjoy.
Great, thanks, Loyd. I'm going to move on to Louise Wyman now. Louise, what role should local people be playing in shaping and maintaining the natural environment in urban areas, and how can a local authority or a developer support their ability to do so?
Thank you. I think I wanted to, first of all, I will come to the question, but I wanted to reflect on Manchester a little bit and the experience that we're having there. And it's great to see some comments actually in the Zoom chat box about Manchester, which I'll touch on as well. So we have a responsibility. I see Manchester, just to be clear, as a massive landscape. So I trained as a landscape architect as well as a surveyor. I've always worked in the built environment. And for me, landscape is a really good scale to think about the city. So it's really a cityscape that we're talking about in Manchester. And the responsibility of Director of Development and Growth, which is my role, is to curate the future of the city and to choreograph a series of open spaces, access to nature, as we're talking about, that green and blue infrastructure. So that really, really matters. And we do that in partnership, and we do it on behalf of the communities and the people of the city. So that's the people who live there, but the businesses who are there, and the visitors as well. Just as Loyd has described, we have a huge amount of people returning to the city now, I'm glad to say, as things opened up at the weekend. So to give you an example of what that looks like, it's great to see in the chat, we've got somebody from TEP talking about the work we've done on what we call Manchester's Great Outdoors Initiative. And so that's celebrating the open spaces within the city, access to the river, city parks. We don't have the wealth of city parks that London has, or even cities like Oxford or Cambridge have, and that's something that we want to develop, and we will develop it with the development community. We've got a fantastically philanthropic development community, I would say, in Manchester, and I just came off a call with Bruntwood, who are one of our core developers who share our ambitions around healthy and green and inclusive cities. And they reminded me that we have an initiative called the City of Trees, where through the planning relationships that we have with developers, we're planting 3 million trees across the city. So actually we can do simple things in streets, in public squares. And we're now seeing, just as Louise and Loyd have outlined, that nature in the city, which is an ancient concept, actually matters more than ever. And we're finding new ways of even relaxing some of our licensing fees so that businesses can put tables and chairs on the street, so that we can kind of occupy the city in a different way. And that feels quite exciting. We're coming up to celebrate a year of Extinction Rebellion activity in the city, and actually, that was a bit of a precursor to some of the ways the city is being used now. So I thought I'd just mention that. So lots of collaboration, I would say, between the city council that I represent, the development community, and of course the citizens that we are accountable to.
That's great, thank you very much. And we are getting a few questions coming in on the chat. Please do add to them. We'll try and get to those when we finish this first part of the webinar. Question for all the panelists now. around natural space. It comes in various forms in urban areas, from large parks to community allotments in the middle of the estates. Which do you feel should be prioritised in future building? Louise Wyman, do you want to start off on that one, actually?
No, that is such a mean question. It's like saying, you know,
exactly.
which is your favourite child?
And the rest we're throwing away, I'm afraid. Yes.
But it is, I mean, the answer I want to give is, of course, all those different scales matter, and you can't kind of do one without the other. So we are working at the scale of the city, the cityscape. But I think, again, we've got to take a lot of learning from this time when we've been more contained, I guess, and more isolated for certain periods. And, you know, even having nature inside your home, because many of our residents don't have a balcony, you know, they probably have quite mean windows. So their access to nature at that point where we were told to stay in our homes and only go out for an hour a day, that was incredibly restrictive. So I think you can bring nature into the city and into your home in a tiny way, you know, it was actually M&S, I think, who had a mustard and cress growing campaign. And so they were giving away, you know, free mustard and cress so that if you had children or whatever age you are, you could grow herbs on your windowsill. So there's the tiny domestic scale of, you know, pot plants. I think when you step outside of your home, then city gardens really matter, and allotments. And we're looking now at our urban spaces in a much more integrated way, in a multifunctional way, I would say, so that there are all these campaigns for edible communities. I worked on a project a few years ago in Ebbsfleet, and we had a piece of work called Edible Ebbsfleet, where we were growing vegetables in the train station, which you wouldn't have thought of normally. So we're looking at how we can grow food, that kind of edible movement, and the health and well-being of produce, as well as access to clean air and access to nature. So that does need to be close to the home. That's a big lesson from lockdown, that nature in the home and immediately outside the home, and then the responsibility of city planners and urban thinkers is to also make sure you've got those connected green spaces. We all know that if you go to an amazing Italian or French city or something, you can walk from one, you know, little square to a plaza to a river corridor, and those are the things that I think will keep people in our cities, attract people back to our cities. So all the scales are significant, but I think you know, clearly it matters so much to our humanity to have nature close to hand.
Louise, Clarke, and I'm going to be a little bit mean now, but that's perfectly fine. I mean, a frequently a criticism that's often levied against developers is that not enough emphasis is given on green space, that, you know, increasingly developments are based around occupying the maximum amount of space for the built environment and reducing down size of gardens and the green space between them. And I'm not suggesting that that applies to yourselves, but how do we, without resulting to legislation, which can take years to go through, what can we learn from this, and how can we encourage developers to put more emphasis into green space? Because already it seems that there's a huge rise in interest in city dwellers looking to move out of the city and into country homes because they want to have that access to green space, and they've experienced the limitations of lockdown.
Yeah, so I think the value of green space, nature, and access to it we've really seen that over the last few months. And I think developers often, you know, do get bad reputation on it, and that's why at the Berkeley Group we've had a strong commitment since 2016 about making sure that we put more nature into our developments than was there before. So we baseline it before we start our development, and then the landscape design, we really ensure that it is throughout the development. It's incorporated, you know, from the green roofs right down to the local scale, to really ensure that we are having a better impact on the environment. So I think I think it's about providing people with that access really close to where they live, like Louise was saying, just on their doorstep, so that they can get out into nature as quickly as possible, and then having those different layers of different landscapes within a development. So, you know, your tree-lined streets that open up into a bigger park, and then more open space. And it is about good design, and it's about thinking about that and the early stages, and that's what we've really been through in the last kind of 5 years, is making sure that we think about it at the earliest stage before we think about the buildings. We think, what are going to be the right access routes, how are we going to put the right green infrastructure in, and then you layer on the buildings on top of that. And then you also think about what's outside your red line and how can you connect it up, so that we can then start to really grow and connect it all up through the city, so that new spaces can develop in lots of different locations around the cities and towns.
Loyd, that seems like quite a critical point in terms of the relationship between, you know, the developed landscape, the privately held developed landscape, and infrastructure like the Royal Parks, because I think possibly, the Royal Parks have often been thought of as being sort of islands, you know, that sit alone inside the, you know, very much loved and welcomed islands, but that somehow sit alone in the cityscape. But actually it is that connection, isn't it, that's going to make things potentially move forward and change in a more radical way.
Yeah, I think there is a holistic issue. And, you know, when you look at London, London is a remarkably green and blue city. It's one of the most green and blue cities in the world. And whilst the Royal Parks provide the sort of spine or the skeleton of this great green and blue network, they only really work in concert with a whole group of local authority, parks, private squares, etc., etc. So one's got to look at this thing very holistically. I just want to slightly mention the fact that we're kind of, this discussion seems to have assumed that the real problem is to do with access to green space in cities. But I think it's worth pointing out that there are a lot of people who live in the countryside and live in non-metropolitan areas who do not have access to great open spaces. You know, this is not just an urban problem. This is a national issue, and the national issue is, how do we make sure that we have enough public realm for people to benefit as citizens wherever they live, whether it's in a small town or a village or a small city or a big city. So let's not assume that the real problem lies with urban areas and that there is no problem about access in suburban and rural areas.
It's a very good point, and from my own experience, I can say that when you know, we moved from southeast London and access to 3 very close, fantastic parks, Crystal Palace Park, Dulwich Park, and a couple of other smaller local parks, to leafy rural Rutland, and access to 0 parks. And the first thing our kids said were, "Where are the parks?" So that's a very well-made point. Okay, so next question for the whole panel is, we currently have a housing crisis that's been building up over many years. Cities are expanding into suburban and rural land, and the government is seeking to level up with huge infrastructure projects across the country. There's an argument this human intervention is having a significant impact on the natural environment. How do we ensure that we have enough good quality housing and a strong economy whilst not ruining the natural world? And is this even possible? Very good point. Louise, Clarke, can I start with you?
Yes, so I think understanding our natural landscape and what is good quality landscape is really important, because often, you know, you see the open fields and we all think that that's good natural landscape, but it's not necessarily, because it's often agricultural land. So from an environmental perspective, it doesn't necessarily function as well as it could do. So I think as we need to reach our housing targets, we also need to understand that we need to start to build in different functioning space within our developments that offer many multiple benefits. So it's not just about grassland, you know, we need to add in woodland, we need to add in wetlands, and we really need to understand how we can start to really enhance the local area through the development process, and hopefully that will catalyse other projects in the area once we start to really understand that value that nature can bring through the development process.
The thing that strikes me, obviously, you know, we're now in a situation where there's been a multi-billion injection into the economy to attempt to offset the impact of coronavirus. Is there a risk that all of this, that everything we're discussing today, falls to the bottom of the important pile because of the you know, the pressing concerns around stimulating the economy, you know, addressing so many issues in the health service, in education, and so on. You know, that having battled to get, you know, as much emphasis on the environment as in the built environment as possible, that it's now all going to crumble away? Or how do we push it to the top of the, or keep it at the top of the agenda? Lloyd, I mean, you sit at the table of a lot of people with a lot of influence. How do we make that happen?
By endlessly banging on about it. You know, it's not very glamorous and it's not very mysterious. It's the endless repetition of the message of the importance of access to nature, the importance of access to open spaces. And I don't think, rather sadly, I don't think it's an argument that can be won on quantitative terms, you know, because quite often we try to value, you know, how do we value the heritage? How do we value landscape? How do we value nature? It's difficult. The more important message, I think, is the psychological, the spiritual, the citizenship value of common places, of places where no one is priced out, of places where everyone is welcome, of places that are open to the public 365 days a year. You know, we have a spiritual message, and that message to me is as powerful, if not more powerful, than any of the economic arguments. But of course, you know, we are in a situation where the economy has fallen off the cliff. People are terribly worried about future employment. Parks are not free. You know, there is a cost to maintaining parks. At a time when the public are demanding that, you know, more and more money be spent on the National Health Service, social care, et cetera, we have a real issue about how we maintain sufficient funding to keep our parks and our public realm the welcoming, enlightening, uplifting places that they should be. And this is an argument that is going to go on and on and on. And, you know, our rhetoric is very important. Our belief and our message is very important. It's going to be the broken record is probably the thing that's going to win in the end.
But Louise Wyman.
Can I come in there?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, because I think it's a great question that you set up. And I'm just reflecting, I forget the precise number, but I think it's about 110 days now that we have, you know, been through this COVID time, if we want to call it that, and much more isolated from each other. And so we've done that because we've prioritized public health. So we took a big decision as a country and obviously globally to prioritize public health above economy, above seeing family, above being in the workplace, all the things that we know we've sacrificed, and much greater human sacrifices through the tragic number of deaths. So I think we've actually already taken a decision to put health first, which is the right thing to have done, despite the challenges it will present and the massive economic forward look that none of us can quite see our way through. what I think it has also done is make us think about resource planning. So I think the question you asked is, you know, around the kind of how do we deliver housing, use resources efficiently, and there's something around that land use planning that we can control, I think, between the organisations we represent. And certainly we're doing a lot of work with the mayor of GM and our communities across the Northwest to prioritise brownfield development first. So where we can do that, and to use natural systems actually to restore sites and to bring a healthier use of land in our post-industrial communities, feels like it matters. There's lots of really good work happening. This was happening pre-COVID, but to develop new garden towns and cities. And again, that addresses some of the stuff away from the core urban areas, away from the core cities. And you're seeing many members of the development community really stepping up with some great ideas of garden cities that integrate. You know, the concept of garden city was the garden and the city integrated. Again, an old concept that has new life, I think. So I think we have to recognise that we're prioritising health. We have to think about the kind of the health of our land and our land use planning, and then the health of our communities, and what are the models of the future, whether it's garden cities or whether it's careful infilling of formerly industrial sites in our towns or even in our rural communities. How are we using the limited resources we have well? And I think that will be the forward kind of challenge that we share.
Well, thank you. Sorry,
if I could just add a coda to that, I think Louise raises some very interesting questions there, because this may be an opportunity for us to question, you know, what is public health? Is public health not being sick? Or is public health having access to culture? Is it having access to beauty? Is it having access to heritage? Is it having access to all the things that make life worth living? And this is a time, I think, to look at the questions of public health in a much broader sense. We know that the lockdown is causing, you know, a huge rise in mental health issues. So people may have been presented from getting sick in a conventional way, but what sort of fallout is going to be affecting our families and our communities? So let's use this as an opportunity to think holistically about public health and about access to the things that make life worth living and meaningful and inspiring for people.
Yes, all very good points. And I pick up on another point that you made, actually, Loyd, although I don't think we have, we probably need another couple of hours on the webinar to resolve it, which is this whole issue of in a world in which there is an obsession with quantifying absolutely everything and being able to somehow rationalize every expenditure against a box being ticked. A lot of what we're talking about can't really be quantified, and it can't sit in a box that can be ticked at the end of the day. It's part of a much wider understanding of human needs, and you know, there's for a lot of people involved in providing the money to make those things happen, it's going to be a challenge actually to try and release the purse strings because of that lack of quantifiable aspect, I suspect. Okay, well, thank you, panel. I mean, we've slightly overrun that first session part of the session, but I think it was very interesting. We've got quite a lot of questions coming up and points being raised, so I'm going to try and get through as many of these as possible. But first of all, is there anything that anyone on the panel wants to add before we move on to the Q&A? Anything that I haven't given you the opportunity to say? Okay, in that case, I'm going to move on to some of the questions that are coming in. One for you, Loyd, to start with. It's from Rohan Malhotra. He's a big fan of the Royal Parks, so that's good news. He says he's a fan of the Royal Parks, its governance, its activities and transparency. Gosh, I mean, glowing terms, Loyd, for you there. He's part of a team that's tasked with trying to learn from it and help some other cities to improve its own practices towards maintaining nature. And one thing that appears to be of key importance with the Royal Parks is its barter income system. Can you explain to us what this is and how it works?
I don't think I could explain it to you without putting the entire audience to sleep, because very few people are interested in the fine details of accountancy. But it is very particular to the Royal Parks and our contract with DCMS. So I would suggest that I would welcome him to get in touch with me direct answer some of these questions.
Okay, you broke up a little bit there, but Rowan, if you didn't quite catch that, that there's an invitation there to contact Loyd and ask that question directly. Okay, so here we are. There's a question for Louise Wyman. TEP has mapped nature-rich and nature-poor wards across Greater Manchester using OS and natural. Oh, it's actually it's a point to all panelists, and it's showing that the OS data, using OS data and Natural England's biodiversity metric. Oh, that's interesting. Are you aware of this, Louise? Is something that you've been involved in?
I am, and I think this is a really great piece of work, actually. So thank you to, I think it's Francis at EP for putting the link up for others to follow. This is actually one. I have to say it was developed before I arrived, so no credit to me. But Manchester has a long-standing history of trying to do more around social value. Actually, it matters to us enormously, and around celebrating the great outdoors. So this is part of an initiative called Manchester Great Outdoors. And one of the things that strikes you when you go to a post-industrial city, which has really kind of regenerated and repositioned itself like Manchester, is there's still a real mix of the industrial history and heritage, as well as obviously the new facilities and the new public realm that's there. And we've got initiatives now that I know TEP and others are helping with to actually open up the rivers. In London, we have that fantastic thing of the Thames being really a massive kind of water park, and also an infrastructure route. You know, the fact the Clipper whizzes up and down, and so much commerce actually travels up and down the Thames now, and that doesn't happen. The river isn't used. We have several rivers in Manchester, but quite often they're culverted. We have our canal system, which isn't even as open as, say, the canals in Birmingham to the public. And at this time, when people are a bit more hesitant around using public transport, then we're really trying to open up canal paths, cycle routes. We've got a brilliant emerging plan for a cycle network connecting in all directions in and out of Manchester. It looks like a kind of colourful star, I would say, because we're a radial city. And so we're really looking at those multiple routes that you can walk, cycle, scooter. And I'll end by saying about a month ago, somebody kayaked to work in Manchester, and that didn't used to happen. And now there's a whole group of people who are kayaking along the canals, and that's starting a program of cleaning up our river corridors and our waterways, and TEP are part of that. So it's a real push for how existing nature in the city that may have been kind of a bit degraded during the industrial period can really be brought back to life in this kind of healthy city phase that we're in.
That's great, thank you, Louise. Just a quick note to those listening in, if you can please add your questions to the Q&A rather than the chat, that would be great, because then everyone can see them. Also, it might give us an opportunity to pick up on some of those questions at the end. We are getting a lot of questions, which I'm afraid we're not going to get through them all. Now this is one, okay, sorry, to go to the Q&A. So this is from Eleanor Mason, listening from Cornwall. It's also really important for rural locations like ours not to be overlooked, which references something you mentioned earlier, Loyd. Many of our small towns are getting urbanized by large-scale housing developers, 1,000+ homes in one build, that simply don't plan in a replacement of the green spaces they devour. This also picks up on what you were talking about earlier, actually, Louise, Clarke, about the use of land and the perceived use of land and future use of land. So the question is, how do small rural towns, and I'll put this to you actually, Louise, Clarke, how do small rural towns who don't have the infrastructure to implement a town plan fend off the huge house builders? You need fending off, Louise.
Yeah, fending off. I think it's, you know, good house building is about community engagement and understanding what that local community wants and needs in that local area. And so I think that is what should be first and foremost, is understanding what needs and wants that local community would require in the new housing. So whether it's open space, access to nature, that should be a benefit that a development can bring if it's not there in the locality. So there should then be the requirement for open space, you know, a green park within that housing development, so that not only the new people that are going to be buying those houses can enjoy, but also the local community can enjoy. On one of our sites, in a rural location, we've put up, you know, sports fields and a cricket pitch, and you know, we've then built a local community facility, and it's not only our residents that are there, it's the whole local community that come there now, well, used to on a Friday, and interact. And I think it is about making sure that you integrate any housing scheme with the local community to provide them with benefits, because we do need to build houses, so we need to get it right as well.
Any of the other panelists want to add to that or respond to that point? I mean, it's a very common situation, a very commonly held belief that housing development, you know, tends to always work to a deficit to what's happening locally. And there seems to me that there's some work to do on both sides. I think probably on the side of developers, but also on the side of the perception of us as citizens. You know, that actually housing development isn't inherently bad. It's something that we have to do. You know, we have to provide new housing, but I guess then needs, you know, there has to be some kind of an interaction between us as citizens and developers in order for us to be able to move forward without the perception that you know, we're being beaten up by the developers.
I think there's a big, to add to some of the things Louisa said, I think there's a really important role in almost that social contract you have in smaller towns, whether it's in Cornwall or you know, parts of the Midlands or the Northwest, wherever you may be, around, we're seeing an awful lot of impetus now around the retrofit movement, actually. And we know that our high streets and our town centres aren't going to come back in the way they might once have been. So actually, how can the development community help us think about the future of high streets, the future of market towns? I think some of that is about getting a residential mix above shops or converting, you know, we're going to see an awful lot of empty retail property and empty office blocks as well. How can they be carefully adapted to be homes that then brings vitality to a town that may be struggling, starts to create, you know, we've done some great work in the West Midlands in a previous role I had around creating innovation hubs in the high street, in former retail units. And I think there's a lot more for us collectively to think around how we revitalize our towns, which are really, really going to need it at this time. And I think housing will be part of the solution, because we still have a housing crisis. We're not talking about it because we're talking about a public health crisis, but we have a massive housing crisis. And so I think one of the solutions is to bring that health and housing and town and city making agenda together in a way that it was in the post-war years, you know, when health and housing was thought about at the same time. The roots of the planning system and the roots of the NHS are in the same Clean Air Acts of the 1947 period.
Yeah. Okay, we're running out of time. I want to try and get through two questions. We've got 5 minutes to get through them. The first one is an interesting one, given that we are now living in, all of us living through a sort of virtual reality almost. It's from Mark Jackson. The question is, what is the panel's thoughts on access to open spaces in a virtualized sense for those who cannot physically access it? It could include the use of extended reality. And he goes on to say, consider this: Minecraft had over 480 million registered users in 2019, and the National Trust sites combined had 27 million. We need to be thinking about the provision and awareness of landscape and place, not only as a purely physical, but also virtual and augmented experience. Loyd, what do you think about that?
I think it's a wonderful idea for those who don't have physical access, what we don't know yet is whether virtual access will provide the same benefits that physical access will. And until we know that, we probably shouldn't go any further.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. Okay, so we're going to move on to this final question, which is around urban greening. So there's a big focus on urban greening. And in fact, it's come up throughout this discussion, urban greening. In London, for example, roofs, walls covered in plants, street trees, pocket parks. The question is how can we as individuals help to green our cities, as well as local authorities and central government, which is a very interesting point. You know, there is a point at which we as individuals should take more responsibility. What are your thoughts on that, Louise Wyman?
I think you're right. We can't be expecting kind of one part of the ecosystem to do everything, if you like. So it is much more about that collaboration between the different players. There's all sorts of underutilized land, I would say, in all our settlements, whether they're villages, towns, or cities. In fact, I have a small terraced house in a Northamptonshire village. The garden was a parking lot when we bought it, so actually it's no longer a parking lot. We leave the car on the street, and we have got a garden at the back. And then I wanted a bit more space because I always love to plant things, and so I realised that the pavement was sort of breaking up, and I went out and planted a couple of years ago foxglove seeds and some wildflower seeds, literally in the sort of cracks in the pavement. And now, actually during lockdown, that has animated the street, and other people have started, you know, putting seeds into cracks in the pavement. And so I think there's a bit of that kind of guerrilla stuff that we can all do in our communities. The guerrilla gardening movement in the US is quite inspiring. There's loads online about that. So I think there are all sorts of scales of operation, that literally from, you know, the windowsill plants to the reclaiming bits of pavement in my case, to the restoring, you know, the work that Berkeley Group and Louise's organisation have done at somewhere like Kidbrooke is absolutely transformational, and it's really clever to have taken a failing estate and turned it into a really progressive community. And I know it's something Tony was immensely proud of as well, and it is a big part of his legacy. So I think, you know, there are numerous scales for us to operate at, and it's a wonderful thing to do. I think the other last reflection from me is that mental well-being that you get from being in nature. I've been spending probably more time than I'd like on, as much as fun as I'm having on this call. I'm spending way too much time on Zoom calls, and my head hurts at the end of the day. And actually I have to go outside and have to go and look at the cracks in the pavement and have to walk. I'm lucky to be able to walk across fields, but I want, you know, the residents of Manchester to at least be able to walk into a green leafy space, or be able to dig around in an allotment, or to put more stuff on their balconies, or, you know, whatever spaces they have. So I think there are umpteen scales of operation, and that's the richness of the conversation we're having.
Louise, Clarke, you know, your development at Kidbrooke, rightly praised. I mean, I grew up not that far from that estate, and you didn't want to walk through that estate, that's for sure. Is there an opportunity? Is it even worth considering for developers and individuals, you know, end users, residents, whatever, to somehow collaborate more on how a place might look at the end, and how the green space might work?
Yeah, so we've started to have those conversations, and started to work with thinking about governance of those green spaces and the maintenance. So what we started at Woodbury Down was the London Wildlife Trust were there and were the experts on what needed to happen. With Woodbury Down, it was previously a reservoir, and now it's an open wetland. And they were the experts, but then we got the local community in to actually do all of the work and help to replant the wetlands and make sure that they could you know, access that nature and help to redevelop it. And I think that's a really model that we want to explore even more. And now every Saturday there's an Eventbrite, and you can go and sign up, and local people can go down and help do whatever maintenance management that is. And then it's overseen by the experts. And I think those models of trying to get community involved, because then they have greater ownership, is something that we're really trying to explore and understand how we can develop that further. So instead of current maintenance and management regimes where they're quite heavily and intensive, and changing them to have experts and the local community is something that Kidbrooke and Woodbury Down has really demonstrated to us that is possible, and it has multiple benefits for us and the community as well.
Thanks, Louise. And finally, over to you, Loyd. I mean, the Royal Parks have always struck me as being a fabulous resource in terms of their capacity to inspire individuals to go and do something, try something. Is there more that the parks can do? I mean, is there more that they can do in terms of working with individuals or community groups now as we come out of this situation?
Yeah, I think there's a great deal more that we can do. We can encourage a greater public understanding, make people realize that parks are just not something where the lawn needs to be mown every now and again, that they're complicated ecosystems, that they're culturally and spiritually rich, and that we all have to play our part. And, you know, as Louise W. said, you know, if everyone did a little, quite a lot could get done. And one of the things that the crisis has pointed out to us is the limits of government. You know, there's only so much that government can do. We need to do more for ourselves, and we need to rekindle our sense of citizenship and kinship and belonging to each other and helping each other. And I think that parks provide a perfect forum in which people can be citizens together.
Well, that seems like a very positive point to leave it on. Now, I should just add there's another event on, the next event is on 23rd of July. We'll be looking at how to bring fun and wonder into the built environment. Oh, I'm signing up for that one. I need some fun and wonder. And you'll be able to access a recording of this discussion and others on the website, the Quality of Life Foundation website, in the coming days. Can I say thank you to Louise Wyman, Louise Clarke and Loyd Grossman for your contribution. It's been extremely interesting. I hope that those who've listened into it have found it interesting too. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank
Thank you.